Arguably the greatest of the Roman emperors was the Emperor Augustus. He had started off as the name Octavian. He was adopted by Julius Caesar, and at Julius Caesar's assassination, after a number of wrangling between Octavian and Pompey and Mark Antony, he becomes the emperor. He becomes the one in charge. And he takes over and really heralds what you could call the golden age for the Roman Empire. He's the one who brings together a lot of the expansion, the connections with other nations and so on, happens during the period of Augustus. Augustus also heralds in a golden age in terms of peace. Is that really after the wranglings about emperor, there's a sense of peace that happens within the Roman Empire. Often it's called the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana. And it's this Pax Romana that really sets up the environment in which you can start with new ideas. It's only in the midst of peace that it's opportune for people to think about religion, to think about what they believe and connecting with it. It also gives people freedom of movement because they don't have to move around all the fights and the battles that could be taking place. And so Christianity comes at a time when there's peace. A time, really a gap in history in terms of this time of peace. Of course, the Pax Romana really was only within the Roman Empire itself, within its confines. There was still lots of fighting happening on the borders of the empire itself. But within, it gave the opportunity of freedom of movement. It gave the opportunity for people to think about different things, to think about new ideas, to actually get taught these new ideas about this Messiah that had come to this backwater little country of the Jews. It gave an opportunity for all of that to happen. And so peace was an integral part of this. But the peace wouldn't last for that long. At least not for the Christians. Because as I said before, right from the time of Nero, we see that they begin to get blamed. They begin to be scapegoated for the problems that the Roman Empire will find. And what we see is that persecution of the Jews also becomes a persecution of the Christians, who at this stage is still really just seen as a sect of Judaism. And so persecution begins to develop, and persecution really will carry on from around about 60 CE all the way through to about the 4th century, or the beginning of the 4th century, where the Roman emperors really didn't want to connect with these Christians. They didn't want the Christians to be the ones setting the agenda for the empire. And of course that all begins to change under when Constantine becomes emperor. And when Constantine becomes emperor, just the opposite begins to happen. The church is in a sense absorbed into the state of Rome. And the church and the state of Rome really becomes an inseparable thing. And so unfortunately, so much of then what is Roman becomes now what is part of church. But at this point, we still see the persecution. That when Paul is writing, when the gospel writers are writing, they're writing into the midst of persecution. We believe by virtue of other writings that 11 out of the 12 apostles were killed. In fact, one by his own hand, which of course is Judas, and the other 10 were martyred. The only one who potentially wasn't martyred was John, who was exiled instead to Patmos. But we don't know with certainty about any of the other apostles. All we know is that many, many Christians were killed for their faith. So persecution, again, is one of the hallmarks of understanding the New Testament. It's written not in a time of easygoing. It's not in a time in which there is no problems. It's not in a time of no violence. It's in a time in the midst of oppressive violence, a time of persecution. And yet it's in the midst of that persecution that the overwhelming theme of the New Testament is love, is forgiveness, and is restoration. What a wonderful antidote to what was happening in society. And you can imagine that it's in the midst of that antidote would have been such an amazing one for people to hear. You can imagine that in the midst of their suffering, in the midst of their persecution, in the midst of the famine, in the midst of the drought, in the midst of the violence that they lived in, came a voice from God saying, I love you and I am with you always. It would have been a message which people would have immediately connected with. And if we see the meteoric rise of Christianity within the Roman world, we can have a glimpse into why that is the case. For the Roman world certainly wasn't an easy world to live in. In fact, it would have been an unbelievably tragic place to live. A place where violence and suffering would have been the hallmark, and where love and forgiveness would have been like a breath of fresh air.